Maybe this is not the time for this.
Okay.
Cut my slides, so they will get them. Interesting. How do you do a live video without having to press the button? I just want to just do a live saying, oh, I'm going live now. What's the YouTube thing? Yeah. No, don't bring the whole thing down. Yeah. Yeah. No, just do it now. I just want to tell people I'm going live. What's up, people? I'm about to go live on the YouTube channel. The stream link is already in the previous post, so hopefully you guys can join in. It's going to be exciting. We're talking about coups in Africa. Let me turn this down. Make sure you tune in. Make sure you tune in. Make sure you tune in. So the link is already in the wife is doing my hair. My wife, so yeah. But the link is in the my previous post, so make sure you tune in. Make sure you tune in. Actually, should I stay on both? What do you think? Yeah, maybe I'll stay on both. Well, you guys, those of you who are my YouTube people, you need to go on YouTube ASAP. Please, please, please. We're on in 2 minutes, 52 seconds. So stay tuned. Stay tuned. What's up, my people? Coming in. Good evening. Eddie the Brito, Lizzie. We're on Instagram as well. This is the first time I'm doing this. I don't know how good this is going to be. An attempt at something new. So let's see. Lizzie, how you doing, my sister? Okay. Okie dokie. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Long time no see. I know I used to do these far more frequently. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, and we're on YouTube. So people come in. Let me give some people. Say what's up if you're here so that I know that you're here. Shout out to my Instagram people. Mary Lee, I'm world famous. Hey, famous, my brother, long time. Dalip, how you doing, bro? Good to see you, bro. We're just talking like 10 minutes ago. Wifey's in there. All right, let me get started. So you guys on Instagram won't be able to see this. So probably the best place for you to do is go into the YouTube link. Wifey, babe, please do me a favor. Just put the link in the Instagram thing. Postmortem, good evening to you. Son of Nock, my brother, long time. Hope you're well. Eddie De Brito, my brother. All right, let's get started. So those of you who are on YouTube, all the slides are there. Baby, just do me a favor, put the link for the YouTube. Okie dokie. So we're talking about the current state of military coups that are occurring across West Africa. And I say West Africa, I should really be specific. I say Western Africa. So shout out to Lizzie. Thank you for the super chat already, my sister. Long time. Blessings. Hello and good evening. I'm feeling a great show ahead. Yes. And I need your communication. You guys need to be participating today, my people. You need to be participating. So let me get started. So just for context, we are in the year 2023. We are not in the year 1995. We're not in 1960. We're not in 1978. We're in the year 2023. We're 23 years into the new millennium. As many of you might know, or you may have heard, on the 26th of July, 2023, Niger, that's the big country that's right above Nigeria, was the latest country in the western part of Africa to have its military remove the elected. When I say elected like that, head of state and take over power. Okay, this is the 5th country in this part of the world, in western part of Africa, in the last 3 years to do so. So for those of you who remember, start of the pandemic, we had Mali just before the pandemic, January 2020. Actually, no, they had one a little bit earlier, actually, 2012, which if you've watched my documentary, 1,000 Years to Timbuktu, I break it down in the second part. Then we had a coup in Chad in the year 2021, April 2021. We had another coup in Guinea. Guinea is a small country where the Niger River begins, small country in Western Africa. That one was September 2021. Then we had another one in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso, again, it's a smallish country, north of Ghana, north of Benin. Okay, thank you, babe, for the link. And then we had finally the Niger coup. Now, those are 5 countries that exist in the western part of Africa, but only 4 of them technically are part of the West African sub-region. So again, this is not a big deal if we are dealing with the year if we're dealing with the 1990s, okay? But we're dealing with the year 2023. So it's quite concerning that we're seeing these military coups. So just so you know, this is West Africa. So you see Mali there on the top, you see Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea on the far left there, and then Chad is just to the so it's off. It's not on the sheet. It's on the other side of the of Niger, so you don't see it. That's technically part of Central Africa. No sound. Are we having a problem with the sound? No sound on YouTube for me. Really, guys, give me a 1 if you can hear me. Both on Instagram and YouTube. Just give me a 1 if you can hear, please. Just make sure we deal with this before we have any issues. Give me a 1 if you can hear. Sound is good. Sound is good. Okay, I don't know why. What about Instagram? How's the sound? Instagram, how's the sound? Okay. Mary Lee, I think you need to check your phone, my sister. I think there's a problem with your phone, but the sound seems okay. Okay, so now this is the dangerous thing that I want to just point out. Okay, so you see this particular region so those of you on YouTube, you see this particular region that we're talking about in West Africa. You see how the Niger River flows from Guinea and ends up in the southeastern part of Nigeria. So the Niger River is the bloodline of Africa, of Western Africa. It happens to be going through these countries. So it starts in Guinea, goes through Mali, goes to passes Burkina Faso, goes through Niger. Okay, so there's a dangerous pattern emerging here. But more dangerous than that, I think, is the new map of Africa that's being created. Okay, and I think when you look at this, it's quite alarming when you see this new map. And this is the best one I could find, but I want you guys to see it. So this is the new map of Africa, where right across the central northern part, you could see that all these places are now in some way under military rule. So the purple one that you see there is Niger. To the east of that, you have Chad, and to the east of that, you have Sudan. So they're not part of West Africa. I know this show is about talking about West Africa, but this is really something that connects all of Africa. So that central part, which, by the way, in the old days, in the Middle Ages, they called this particular region the Sudan area. So there was the Western Sudan, which was the area of Mali, Niger, and then you had Sudan. Sudan, coincidentally, in the Arabic language means land of blacks. Bilal la Sudan means land of black people. Okay, so this is what's going on at the moment. So that's the new map of Africa. So right across this particular region, and this is not a coincidence, by the way. This is not a coincidence. Okay, Africa for a long time has been the battlefield of foreign powers. And there's no difference now, except that the foreign powers that we're dealing with are slightly different. Okay, slightly different in the way that they approach. Key thing about Niger, because we're speaking about Niger right now, Niger, it's rich in uranium. Okay, so without uranium from Niger, obviously something is going to happen. So now we have a military situation. Let's see how we progress from that. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about quickly is just the growing shift. Let me take this off for a second. The growing shift in power from the West, Those of you who've been watching my lives over the last few months, especially, I talk a lot about this. The way power is shifting from the traditional Western world to a different model in the East. So I'm talking about places like China, talking about places like, in some way you can include Russia there, Middle East. Power is moving to those particular places. It's inevitable. Africa has been and will continue to be the playground of power due to its land and the resources that are found in that part of in this particular continent on the planet. So we are seeing this in real time. It's happening in our lifetime. And maybe, I don't know how old some of you people are, but those of you who are maybe in your teens or in your 20s, by the time you get to your later years, another 60 or 70 years, the world will look very, very different for you. In the same way, if you look at my parents, for instance, when my father was 10 years old, the British Empire controlled a quarter of the world, quarter of the planet. And my father now, who's 88. Oh my God, his birthday I missed his birthday. Anyway, my dad now, who's 88, has seen Britain go from this massive colonial power to this very small figure that is just barely holding on to Scotland. Just barely holding on to Scotland. So in that sense, the world is changing right before our eyes. So let's go through the timeline of military coups in Africa. And we don't have time for this because military coups for a very long time have been commonplace. So let me just go through it in context. Africa, for the most part, became, if you want to call it independent, Africa became independent from about 1960. Many countries became independent in 1960, some in 61, some in 62, 63, with the exception of the Portuguese colonies. So if you remember the Portuguese, they didn't want to give up power at all. In fact, it got so bad that the colonies that they had in Africa had to eventually fight, like literally fight, guerrilla armies, fighting in the bush, getting arms from different parts of the world in order to take control from the Portuguese. And then you had a thing called the Carnation Revolution. For those of you who've seen my movie Mona, this is what the film is essentially about. It's about the changing of power in the 1960s from the Portuguese to the African in places like Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. Now, there's also another later stage, and that tended to happen in further south of Africa. So this is the apartheid era states. So places like Zimbabwe didn't get independence till 80, 81, Namibia, 1990, and then South Africa, of course, we all know South Africa, they essentially had independence from Britain in 1910, but 1994 really was when everybody had the vote. Okay, so Southern Africa, it's in the 90s, and then the apartheid era states in the 70s, but most of the other states were in the 1960s. There are other places like Algeria that had to fight too, but for the most part, around the 1960s, many places were independent. Now, if you look at pre-2000, right? So let's go from 1960 all the way to, let's say, 1999. Coups were just something that, not just in Africa, by the way, let's just put this in context. Coups were commonplace across the continent, but across South America as well, across Asia. We had something like about 40 different coups across the continent in that time period. Nigeria, my country, by the way, Nigeria alone had about 8 successful coups between 1966 and 1995. A few months ago, I did a live show where I did a timeline of Nigeria's independence Nigeria from independence up until the most recent election we had in February. So if you want to go back and watch that, maybe I'll pin that to the video later, but you could see exactly what was happening. So from 1966 to 1995, Nigeria, the giant of Africa, had 8 successful coups. So it just gives you the kind of context of how often this thing was happening. The democracy that was promised at the time was just not working. And in most cases, the military kept taking over and things rarely ever improved. The military just kept taking over. There was a period, when I was, I won't say my age, but if you go in the mid 80s, for instance, you had a coup in, I think, 1983, another follow-up one in 1985, another one in 1993. I mean, so, if you were born in the 80s, you saw at least 3 changes of power, by the military. So that's just Nigeria. Let's not make this about Nigeria. This is about Niger. Now let's go post 2000. So after the year 2000, we saw what we call the third wave of democracy across Africa. Third wave meaning in 1960, you had the first wave of leaders. You had people like Kwame Nkrumah. You had people like Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria, or Zeke. You had Julius Nyerere. You had Jomo Kenyatta. Well, Jomo Kenyatta, well, a little different story. You have Gamal Abdel Nasser. You have Sekou Touré in Guinea. You had so many different. That was the first wave. And in many cases, that first wave was ousted. There was a military coup and then a transitional government that brought in a second wave, or second republics. And then by the time you get to the end of the 90s, when the military coup era had ended, we start to see the third wave post 2000. Okay? Post the year 2000. Again, places like Nigeria from 1999, they saw it. If you look at somewhere like Togo, small country called Togo, where I went to school, Togo had a first wave, then the military coup. They brought in a man called Nasimbe Eyadema. Eyadema ruled literally until the year 2004. He died, and then his son, a Democrat, took over. We see another kind of thing in Democratic Republic of Congo, or Zaire, or however you want to call it. You see the first group with Patrice Lumumba as prime minister, and then the my mind escapes me. What's the president's name? What's his name? Anyway, and then they're ousted. Mobutu Sese Seko takes over, ends up being there for a very long. Well, he leaves, then comes back. Then in the 1990s, you have Kabila, Laurent Kabila. Laurent Kabila comes in, he dies, and his son Joseph takes over from around 2000 up until, I think he only left in 2018, I think. So for like 18 years. So you have this second, third wave that is coming in post 2000. And in some cases, like the case of Nigeria, it seems like it's a seamless transition of power, seamless in some cases. Still a democracy. Elections are held. Sometimes they're obviously many of the times they're quite dubious, but sometimes they're not as dubious. And you start seeing changes of power. We see it in Gambia recently. Yahya Jammeh, who had been there from 1994, there was an election where this guy who was the story was his former security guard in London, goes back, ends up winning an election, and then eventually Yahya Jammeh is forced to leave because he's lost the election. But post 2010, we started to see hints of coups and attempted coups right across the continent. Okay, so really 10 years after this so-called third wave of democracy. Now, in that time period, believe it or not, there's something around 70 coup attempts or successful coups / coup attempts in that time period. We have successful regional coups, if you want to call them that, which have removed military dictatorships, military rulers. The Arab Spring is probably the best one to explain my point. If you look at the Arab Spring in 2011, where you see right across North Africa, the ousting of former military men. Gaddafi, don't forget, was part of the military. Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was part of the military. You start to see all these guys getting kicked out. And as they're getting kicked out, and they're not getting kicked out by soldiers, but they're getting kicked out for the most part by the people. You also see the same thing in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso in 2014, Blaise Compaoré was the president. He got kicked out by the people. There was a transitional government. In fact, myself and my wife, we went for FESPACO Film Festival. We had dinner at the president's palace at that time. This is about 3 years after the coup. Not the coup, but the removal of power. Then in Mali, again, if you watch my documentary, 1,000 Years to Timbuktu, I talk about this. You have the military junta that takes control in 2012. Okay. Then later, you even have a coup in Egypt because if you remember, the Muslim Brotherhood eventually became the elected or the power in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood eventually with Mohamed Morsi, if you remember, there was a coup that ousted them. You see it in Central African Republic and many, many other places, right? So this idea of coups ever ending is just a fallacy. Coups have never really stopped. The attempted coups from the military are the ones that are kind of just chilled out. But don't also forget, A lot of these people that ended up taking over are in some way connected to either previous governments or the military themselves. You take Nigeria, for example. Muhammadu Buhari, who has just been the previous president of Nigeria, just spent 8 years in power. In 1983, was president of Nigeria as a military man. Olusegun Obasanjo, who was president from 1999 to 2007, in 1979, I think it was it 79? After Murtala Mohammed. I think 77 to 79, he was military president as a general. So these guys just took off. Yahya Jammeh from Gambia was a soldier, took over, eventually removed the military uniform, put on the agbada. It's my guy in Uganda, Museveni was a soldier, eventually took off the uniform, became a Democrat. In some ways, you could say the exact same thing about Paul Kagame. Paul Kagame was a soldier, took off the uniform, became a Democrat. So what you're seeing in Africa is really just the same military rulers wearing the democratic uniform. So in many ways, you can say democracy was never, ever real. Let me just take some of these chats, comments that people are making now. Yes, I read the super chat. My sister Lizzie, thank you so much. You Instagram, I hope you guys are following me. Shay, what's up, brother? Akbe, good to see. Appy, excuse me, good to see you, my brother. Right, so Kwame Olatunji, brother, long time, man. How you doing? Good to see you. Son of Nok, these happen to be civilian coups, dubious democracy. Very well said. Yes, Kagame, JJ Rawlings, absolutely. Good. Okay, everybody knows enough about this stuff. So let me keep moving. So next slide. Where am I? Okay, so this is just a summary of what I was saying. Again, I could put it back a little bit, put it on a little bit later. So why do coups happen? And here I have an image of, or three images of people who are not from Africa. One, you have Pinochet, you have Idi Amin of Uganda, and you have Mussolini. The point I'm trying to emphasize here is that military coups in general, are things that have taken place across the world. In some ways, you can argue that the Nazis taking over Egypt was a military coup. And the reasons why the military coups that happened in the western part of Africa, Niger, Mali, etc., the reasons why are mostly similar to why these coups happened in these parts of the world, with the fascists in Italy, with Idi Amin and Pinochet in South America. So let me just explain to you what I mean by that, a little bit more detail. So the role of government is supposed to be people-focused. When I say people-focused, it needs to be concentrated on how to develop the lives of the people. But instead, what's happening? Money is in the hands of politicians. It's supposed to be, government is supposed to be development-oriented. In other words, they're supposed to be focused on how to take the country from point A to point B, and then from point B to C, all the way until you get to point Z, and then you find some other way to keep going. But what ends up happening is, if you look at how we are now, we're even less developed than we were at independence. I challenge you to go to any part, this is pre-China's involvement in Africa, to go to any building that was erected, say, during the colonial period, and see how well maintained it is without the involvement of China or some sort of foreign power. So in many ways, even just the roads, we're talking about roads and danger and sewage, these basic things that are issues, you will find that they haven't been developed. Government is also supposed to be preemptive when it comes to peace and security. When I say preemptive, I mean they're not supposed to wait for insecurity to happen. They're supposed to plan for it. In other words, find intelligence, find ways to advance the technology so that they could stop it. But if you look in many parts of Africa, and in particular these countries that I'm talking about, they could care less. And for those of you who know anything about the trans-Saharan migration crisis, you know that Niger is the main jumping off point. In other words, you have porous borders between them and Nigeria, and them and their neighbors too. Government is also supposed to be building infrastructure. Okay, many of you, those of you who travel to West Africa, to many parts, you know infrastructure is not one of our strong suits. Okay, government is supposed to be creating employment. In other words, they're supposed to be ensuring that people have jobs to do so that they don't deviate from what they're supposed to be doing and go and join jihadists, so that they don't go and join militant groups to threaten for oil and for power. they're also there to try and ensure that these people, the students, are being educated, not going on strike for the basic necessities that they need in school. They're supposed to provide education. This is what they're supposed to be doing. But as you can see, people in Africa, and in particular this part of the world, are so desperate to leave the country that they are happy to go through the Sahara Desert and then over the Mediterranean Sea. In Niger, we call it jakbayin. That's the Yoruba word for it. It's like they just want to leave. We have another brain drain happening as a result of governments. So this is why coups are happening for the most part. Now, let me give you guys a little bit of background. For those of you, again, who are not on the YouTube link, you need to jump on it. Let me give you a little bit of background to the coup in Niger. Okay, remember, we're talking, for those of you just tuning in, we're talking about the coups, the recent spate of coups in the western part of Africa, beginning with Mali, then we had Guinea, then we had Burkina Faso, we had Niger, and then we had Chad, and then we had Niger. Chad, of course, again, for clarity, is not part of what we call the West Africa technically, but it's the western part of Africa. So General Bazoum, that's the former, sorry, General Bazoum. Bazoum is the former president. I say general. I love it's so ironic. I made a note here. I put general by accident. Might as well be. So Bazoum is part of. First of all, when you look at the guy, you can already see that there's potentially some sort of sticking point for those of you who are sensitive to color and race, particularly my people who are watching from America. So what you'll notice about him is if he's lighter skin. There's a word they use. I don't really like using it, but they call it Shua Arab. So it's like he identifies more as an Arab person rather than sub-Saharan African. Now his ethnicity is actually, or not ethnicity, but his group is in that particular part of the world is about 5% of the population. So what you already have is a minority kind of ruling the majority. Again, something like what we saw in Sudan that forced Sudan to split into two countries. You had the kind of lighter skinned people, if you will, Arabic people ruling over the darker skinned, more African people. So, I mean, he did, you know, and even his election that he won is quite dubious, but I don't want to go into too much detail about that. I think it's a waste of time. I don't think it's necessary. But he put in reforms that were quite silly. He was quite radical in the things that he was trying to do. He said, for instance, like, I mean, these are some of the things that he did. Like, he said you can't have second wives if you're going to be in his cabinet. So in other words, only if you have one single wife. Now, that might sound fine to a Western audience, but really what he's saying is religion or your culture is not important to me in a way, right? He was essentially there doing the bidding of the West. His generals, this is a very important point. So again, we're talking about Niger. Niger is an area that has quite porous borders between them and its neighbors to the north. This is a main jumping off point for people going to the Sahara, trying to get to Northern Africa and then eventually to Europe. If you remember this story, for those of you who follow the news, a few years, about a year and a half ago, his generals had reported that they found the militants, they're going after the militants. And the French said to him, no, don't let your guys go after them. Don't go after them. Imagine the Islamists who are wreaking havoc and killing innocent civilians. The president says, okay, his president is informed by his generals that we've got them in our sights. And he says, don't. So it's essentially he's a puppet. And by the way, this is not something that we see just in that part of the world. We see it in Nigeria too, further south. Under, I think it was Goodluck's administration, when the Boko Haram guys had, if you remember the girls that were kidnapped, if you remember all the different things that were going on in that time, at that time with Boko Haram and all the militant groups that were in that particular part of the world. If you remember, Goodluck Jonathan had them in his sights. The US even said, we're going to support you, and he refused to do anything about it. You also had reports of people saying that what were they saying? That that soldiers were being shot in the back. I personally spoke to a soldier. In fact, he drives me around when I go to Abuja in Nigeria, and he told me, "Look, we're basically fighting a war. Like if you listen to your commanding officers, you'll be killed, because these people were not concerned with trying to end this war, and that is an order that comes straight from the top." But let me not talk about Nigeria. This is not about Nigeria. So that's the background of the coup. So you have a picture there of where Niger is, so you could see how strategic it is. You have Algeria to the top, Libya above it, Mali to the west, Burkina Faso southwest, Benin, relatively peaceful, Nigeria, and then Chad. So this region, this is the Sahel region. This is the region just below that makes the transition between tropical West Africa and then the Sahara Desert. So this is really, these are big countries, but they're really vast deserts, if you will, vast open area spaces. So just so you know. Okay, let's move on. So now what I wanted to talk about quickly is just the state of, actually, no, let me go back a second. Let me stick to Niger, actually. So I think it's important to know, even when you talk about all these different countries that we're dealing with, shout out to my people on Instagram, by the way. Courtney Michelle, good to see you, my sister. Snoopy, good to see you. Binetu, Nangadef, Amin, my brother, good to see you, brother. Good to see you. We'll do lives in a bit, guys. We're just gonna go through this. So those of you who are not on the YouTube link, just scroll up. It's better to be on the YouTube link. Trust me, there's the slides in there, and we can be more interactive. Shout out to my YouTube people. Lizzie, what are we saying? So VP Sketima was allegedly harboring Shetima is the name, was allegedly harboring a Boko Haram fighter at his residence. But I won't go there. Let's not go there. Again, these are the things that we're talking about. These happen to be civilian coups. Okay, cool. Read that. Let me go back. So Niger just happens to be the 7th poorest country in the world. Okay, being the 7th poorest country in the world, and its neighbors Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad. I think between those four of them, they all fall between the top 15 poorest countries in the world. However, Niger today has uranium, and the uranium is being exploited by France. Niger also, if you look at the earlier map that I put, Niger is also the source of water for it's one of the major sources of water in that part of the world, because it's the river Niger flows, makes the arc and that bend before going down into Nigeria. Also, the region of Niger is the final hope for the US in the Sahel region. The Sahel region, that's that strip of land that connects, that goes right through the center of Africa, or the center of Northern Africa, that goes from desert to tropical. Okay, it's the final hope for the US in that region. You have something like 4 EU/US military bases in Niger. Okay, so AFRICOM, the EU, and, if you will, a French contingent. Boko Haram in that part of the world is continuing to kill Nigerian citizens. Still, despite all this intervention, despite all these military bases, despite the democracy that was going on in this part of the world. So let's look at the coup. Now, if the coup wasn't warranted, first of all, there's no way you could say the coup wasn't warranted, because I've given you the political background to this place. But then you wouldn't be able to see people rejoicing in the streets as you're seeing them now. People are jubilating in the streets that the democratic elected president has been removed and the military has taken power. So why is it that the outsiders are crying so loudly when the people are rejoicing? Just think about that. The outsiders, the French, the Americans, all these people, even ECOWAS, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is the body that governs, I suppose, this West African sub-region. Everybody is crying. But Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, the countries who are in the exact same position and whose militaries took the same action, support what has happened in Niger. Let's go into that. So, for those of you who don't know what ECOWAS is, or let me go back. There's a map there, so you can see what the West African sub-region is. You essentially have 15 countries, okay? Those 15 countries, if you can see, Mali and Niger happen to be the biggest in terms of land mass, but Nigeria is the biggest population and the wealthiest country, okay, in theory. In 2014, 15, the economy was rebased and it was supposedly the biggest economy in Africa at the time. For a country with no power, it's a shocking ability that they could be a big economy. But again, we won't go there. But ECOWAS, which ECOWAS basically stands for the Economic Community of West African States. Okay. Now, historically, it was established to support what was initially called the Organization of African Unity, which has now become the African Union. Because again, Africa is such a big place. So that particular block of West Africa was sort of managing its own affairs. You have SADC in Southern Africa, you have the EAC in Eastern Africa. You have different subgroups, but ECOWAS is the more prominent. Because if you remember, in the 1980s and 1990s, you had a war in Sierra Leone, you had a war in Liberia, and ECOWAS stepped in heavy to do a lot of good work, okay? Even sending troops in to help quell the issues going on in Sierra Leone and Liberia. So ECOWAS is very influential. In fact, it's Yahya Jammeh's situation, the president of Gambia a few years ago, lost an election, didn't want to go, and the ECOWAS presidents, or the ECOWAS leaders, Nigeria usually at the forefront of it, and Ghana as well, and Senegal, went in and said, no, my guy, Jammeh, you have to go, you have to go. And they convinced him to go. Okay, so they have some power. But again, they're managing a region of 15 states. They had a military, they used to have a military called ECOMOG. Okay, so that was the army that was responsible. It's a collective of West African soldiers, but really headed by Nigerian soldiers who would go and, do peacekeeping in these different parts of the world, in different parts of West Africa, so Liberia, Sierra Leone, etc. So again, because Nigeria is the main, Nigeria is almost like the daddy of it, right? Or the mommy. For those of you very particular about your sexes, but Nigeria is the person that tends to head it. In fact, at the current point in time, Tinubu, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, the president of Nigeria, is the chairman of the ECOWAS. So it's funded by Nigeria for the most part, and mostly Nigerian troops tend to be a part of the peacekeeping that goes into it. Now, they treated this Niger coup differently, as you would imagine. Again, if you look at the map, you would know why. They treated this Niger coup very differently to the way they treated the Mali coup, the Burkina Faso coup, and the Guinea coup. They didn't even give them, by the way, they didn't even give them a chance, the coup plotters, a chance to respond. They immediately gave them the sanctions and then followed it with an ultimatum. They basically said, we're going to give you, 7 days. And they didn't even rule out military intervention, which is very interesting. We'll talk about that in a minute. But ECOWAS, once again, in situations like this, has shown itself to be hypocritical. They criticize the Niger coup, for example, which is supported by the people, but they're not critical about, they don't criticize the stolen elections that happen all across the continent or the sub-region. They don't criticize it. Nigeria, let's face it, for those of you who watched my live when I was talking about the Nigerian election, that Nigerian election was probably one of the most corrupt elections you've seen, to the point where even what is legislated about the winner having to have 25% of the capital as well as 25% in each geopolitical zone, the winning party did not have that. The party that actually won did not win. And it was announced that they did not win. So you have a president that's stepping in very dubious circumstances to head ECOWAS and is then going to be critical to people who have decided we're going to take power in our own hands. The military is going to step in because the democratically elected government is not doing anything. But ECOWAS under Nigeria is being hypocritical once again. So the other reason, if you look on your map, Nigeria and Niger are essentially one place. The northern border of Nigeria is basically Niger. The language groups, as you know, the borders of Africa were designed by, how do we describe this? Were designed by lines by Europeans in 1884, 85. So it wasn't designed based off, okay, these people are different to these people. No, they just put a line through people's houses and said, one side is for me, for France, one side is for England. So you have a situation now where people in Niger and people in Nigeria are very similar in language and so on. In fact, there's a joke that Buhari, our former president, was from Niger. They kept saying that there's a guy called Jibril from Niger that he was cloned and he just came in to be president of Nigeria. It's somewhat of a joke. Whether it's true or not is not important. But the coup itself poses, if you look at just because of the border, it poses a threat, an existential threat to ECOWAS leaders. Why? Because what you have is a changing of government. And the closer it gets to Nigeria, the closer it gets to Ghana, the closer it gets to Senegal, the more people start to fear that it will happen to them next. And so Nigeria has to be very aggressive, or ECOWAS has to be very aggressive about making these threats. That's why they've made this threat, because Niger, not only because of its connection to the Western powers, with the AFRICOM troops that are there, with the EU troops that are there, with the uranium that is provided to France, which France will no doubt be on the phone to places like Nigeria saying, you need to stop this. They will then say to themselves, we have to be very aggressive about it. Okay. Now, if ECOWAS troops go in, not only does it threaten the livelihood of Nigerians, people in Niger and Nigeria, but there's Algeria to the top too. This is severely dangerous language to be using, especially for a president who's only been there 4 weeks. They're giving them 1 week or they will consider intervening. Just think about that. You are giving a sovereign nation, regardless of whether you like the military or whatever, you're giving them 1 week or you will consider intervening. Now, if you look at the AU, the African Union, which is really the body that oversees Africa politically. Now, they don't have a standing army, by the way, so it's not as if they could do anything. It's not like there's not one United States of Africa, which is part of the problem as well. But they even said, you know what, let's give them 15 days. We'll give them 15 days. Let's figure something out. Hopefully, they'll come to the table. But ECOWAS is going there very aggressively. I've already spoken about the hypocrisy, but you know, at least the African Union is being a little bit more diplomatic about it. You see, ECOWAS themselves, you know, the hypocrisy is ridiculous. When Alpha Condé, who was the former president of Guinea, was killing people at the last elections, ECOWAS, when he won the elections, they gave him a hand. They clapped for him. And then as soon as the coup, the military takes over, they go and criticize, oh, you guys shouldn't be there. But you're clapping for the man who killed people to get the elections won. Even the same thing with the military, the president of Chad, General Mahmat, the guy who won the coup. Shout out to Amin, by the way. My brother's from Chad, so that's his country. He wasn't condemned either. Okay, so anyway, so the point I'm making here is that the hypocrisy shown by ECOWAS, in particular, the president of Nigeria, it also shows his naivety at governing. Okay, so let's move on now. Commonality amongst the coup states. Okay, I'm trying to rush through this because I know we're gonna have a lot of questions at the end. So let me just go through it. Oh my God, there's so many comments. Shout out to my people on IG. Those of you who are there, thank you, Uche Chuku. Wifey's put the link in there if you want to join us on YouTube. So let me just read through some of these comments and then we'll move on. I believe ECOWAS is really controlled by the West. Yeah, I mean that's not even a statement. That's straight up fact. Famous Iroya, shout out to Famous, amazing documentary filmmaker. I met him in Egypt like 7 years ago. Amazing filmmaker. Tito District, good to see you, brother. I've been waiting for this broadcast all week. Wish I could have been here on time. No problem, just watch it back, brother. Lizzie, my sister, real talk. Buhari said if he was disturbed during retirement that he was going to move to Niger. And then the election tribunal is about to give its ruling. Yes, so it's in courts. So point she's making here is about the Nigerian election that took place in February. They're in court now and they're about to make a ruling. So the Labour Party has been fighting their case to say, look, you know, but by the way, I don't know any election since 1999, I think, except maybe 1999, that they didn't take it to court. I think from the 2003 election, 2007 election, every single one of them, the party that lost went to court. So, you know, anyway, that's neither here nor there. So anyway, let's go back to the topic. So the commonality amongst the coup states. So again, that graphic shows you, or that image shows you the areas where the coups have taken place. So you have Guinea. It's almost like in a straight line going through the sunny regions, if you will, of Western Africa. So when you look at these places carefully, and when you just study the names, study the languages that they speak, you will find that they are all former French colonies. Okay. We'll explain a little bit more later about what that means. You will find again that it goes through that strip of the Sahel region. Okay, nothing happens in isolation. Things don't happen just by pure coincidence. Okay, so it just happens to be through that Sahel region. These places are largely Islamic as well. When I say large, I don't mean that everybody's a Muslim there. I just mean that they are largely Islamic in terms of Islamic culture is more dominant there. It's more prevalent there. And it seems to be it's another thing that they have in common. The other thing is the growing insecurity in this region. Again, this is the same region where you have the migrants going through, whether they're coming from Senegal side, whether they're coming from Nigeria side, Ghana side, they're all traveling through this region to go north. Okay. Those of you, again, who watch my broadcast, which broadcast was it? I was talking about my experiences when I was traveling from Timbuktu in Mali back down to Bamako. So from the desert-ish, kind of the desert, the Sahel region into Bamako, the greener part, slightly greener part. I met a kid from Guinea, so this is the route that they're going through. I've also written a film about this, by the way, called Spirits of the Sands, which hopefully will get made next year. This is the sort of thing that I was trying to explain, how this region is really just empty. So there's the growing insecurity in the region. And then there's also the fact that they're all part of what you would call the western part of Africa, which I would use the old name, because I think the old name that the Europeans used to use for this region is so apt at this point, which is the Sudan area. The Sudan area. They used to call that western part the Western Sudan. And then, of course, the area of Sudan today and South Sudan. All right, so let me deal with these points individually, and then we'll start moving forward. So France, number one. For those of you who know the currency that is used in the regions of Western Africa and parts of Central Africa, it's a currency that is essentially printed by France. It's called the franc CFA, right? CFA franc, Centre Francophone d'Afrique, or something like that. Centre West African franc. Now, let me give you a little bit of background about this. So, as independence was coming, so remember the 1940s. So let's go back a little bit. Yeah, the First World War, France and the Allies, they went and got troops from their colonies, not in large numbers, to go and fight in the trenches in Europe. But when it came to the Second World War, they got a lot more. In fact, if you watch my documentary, Dahomey and Vodou, I take you to where the first shots of the First World War were fired. They were fired in Togo, in a place called Wahala. Second World War, a lot more troops came in. But those troops, when they came in, they were actually allowed to fight at this point. Okay, when they were allowed to fight, they came back in the same way you had the Red Summer in America with the black troops coming back. You had a similar thing going on in Ghana, in Senegal, in Ivory Coast, and so on. Well, they weren't called that at the time. But troops were coming back and saying, no, if we can go and fight and die for you in Europe, we should have our independence. So there was this clamoring for independence. Now, the British set theirs up quite slickly with their colonies in some places. They were quite slick with the way we did it. But France said that even if we let you be independent, you're still going to be we're still going to be in control of you. So they said, for instance, you will have the franc CFA. So we're going to give you a currency that you can use, but you're independent. In some cases, you will pay a tax for the colonial mansions that we've built already, including the presidential palace, which we saw. If you know the story of Laurent Gbagbo in Ivory Coast, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But they basically said, we will still control you economically. We'll get first dibs on any oil or any resources that we find in this part of the world. We're basically going to control it. So it's quite interesting. Most countries opted in, with the exception of Guinea under Sékou Touré. He said, I'm going to step away from this thing. And Guinea, which is one of the countries that's been involved in the coup, not part of that particular franc CFA region, but they stepped away from it. They said, we're going to try and do like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. And they actually got their independence slightly earlier to the rest of the countries in West Africa. You see that bottom image, you can see the parts of Western Africa that use the currency. So we have the currency aspect. We also have the fact that France has a stranglehold over these colonies, these former colonies. They've had the power to be able to remove leaders. You know the story of in Burkina Faso with Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara was a military ruler, took over in 1984, I think it was. Is it 84? 84, 83. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's 84. 84, one of them, I think 84. He took over, went about trying to change the way the society was run, move away from the corruption, move to more, instead of the politicians driving the big Mercedes cars, let's give them, more economical cars. Let people start dressing in their own clothes. He changed the name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso. This man was a sworn enemy of France just by what he was doing. Went publicly to the UN, ripped France to shreds and democracy to shreds and imperialism to shreds, and naturally he was killed coincidentally by his number two, who eventually became a dictator from when he died, 1987 till 2014, Blaise Compaoré. So it's interesting. So anytime you challenge France, they do something to you, okay? And it's funny because at independence, you take Ivory Coast and Senegal, for instance. Ivory Coast and Senegal had a president in Ivory Coast called Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who was basically the president from independence all the way to, I think, mid-90s. You had another guy called Léopold Senghor from Senegal. I think Binetou is from Senegal. Remind Binetou to Senegalese. I think she's Senegalese. Somebody in the chat on Instagram is from Senegal. So you just confirm. So he's what was I saying? Yeah, so Léopold Senghor, these are men who fought for the French during the Second World War. In fact, if you read, and they were both writers, by the way, historians and poets, and they wrote about France Afrique, and these are the people that the negritude term was really being used by these guys. So these people were able to maintain control of France in Ivory Coast and Senegal. It's why Ivory Coast, when they started having conflict in the mid-2000s, people were like, where did this come from? It's because the people, France had controlled the country under a puppet leader. Senegal, same thing. Senegal, for the most part, has never been at war. If you look at all those countries in West Africa, it's never been at war. And that's because the French kept the peace by keeping a puppet in control and then making sure that he kept everybody in line. Despotic leadership, by the way. This is what it was. So historically, anybody who opposed anything to do with France was dealt with by those regional powers. You see something similar going on with Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, except obviously he had Belgium and US as his bankrollers. The Laurent Gbagbo episode of Ivory Coast is very important. For those of you who want to go do a little bit more research, you have a man who essentially challenged things and he was removed. And ironically, the guy that they replaced him with, a man called Ouattara, Alassane Ouattara. Is it Alassane? Yeah, Alassane Ouattara. He was, he ended up ruling for 10 years, did all sorts of damage, even when it got them to change the constitution so that he could stay even longer. It's funny, no one even brings that up and talks about that as a coup in itself. So obviously with France having this much control for 60 years, really 150 years if you include the colonial period, there's been a growing anti-French sentiment across Africa and across Africans around the world, across Europe as well with Africans. Kemi Seba, for instance, is an activist from France. For those of my Parisians, my French people, shout out to you. Has been an activist trying to get rid of this CFA currency. Let's move away from dependency of France. Obviously, these countries want their freedom to choose their trading partners. They want to be in control of their resources. So these places are not. These places are clearly not allowing them to do so, and so we could see why France has now become public enemy number one in these regions. Next region, the next point I wanted to bring up is the Sahel. The Sahel in itself. Now let's go post 9/11. It's post September 11 to September the 11th, 2001. You've seen Islamic terrorism becoming, and I don't want to say Islamic terrorism, but terrorists under Islam, under the banner of Islam, have been a global destabilizing factor. There's no way of putting it other than that. Now, whilst it stemmed in Europe, post-Iraq, whilst they've calmed it down in Europe, post-Iraq, post-Iran, Afghanistan war, it's taken a whole new it's gone to a whole new level in Africa, particularly this region, especially after 2011. Why? Because you have the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. The fall of Muammar Gaddafi meant that Libyan border further south of Libya had been opened up. So whatever control was maintained in Libya is now gone. So you have very, very porous borders with arms, with idealists passing through. Excuse me. Shout out to Mark. Good to see you, my brother. Good to see you. Shout out to my people on IG as well. Let me just read some of these comments before I move on. Eddie, good to see you, brother. I think you have learned a lot today. Mark, Camp de Charoy, very good movie. I like to do this too. Thank you very much, Mark, for bringing this up. Camp de Charoy is a film by Ousmane Sembène. Basically breaks down this, for those of you who are familiar with the U.S. and what they call the Red Summer, which is African-American troops coming back from the Second World War saying, no, we're not taking this. Actually happened after the First World War as well. Camp de Charoy is like the Senegalese version of it. It's a true story. Check it out. I think you can find it on YouTube, actually. Mr. Siad, good to see you. And what did France do to Guinea for not joining in? For not joining? Absolutely shameful. Absolutely. Economic castration, essentially, was what happened to Guinea. Sorry. France-Afrique is Houphouët-Boigny, négritude is Senghor encore. Yeah, exactly. So La France-Afrique. This is like the equivalent of the British. The sun will never set on the British Empire. Well, the French people actually actualized it in Africa, at least for a period of close to 40 years after independence. So that's an interesting statement. Thank you for that. All right, back to what I was talking about. So where were we? Sahel region. Okay, so post 9/11, this region has become even worse. You know, in many ways, you could look and see the terrorism that occurs in the West doesn't happen as much. But in Africa, the threat of terrorism, in this particular part of Africa, is big. And it goes right across even into Kenya with Al-Shabaab in the east, etc. Now, these 5 countries under this coup are among the largest countries in Africa, but also the poorest countries in the world. So when you come to defense, when you come to resources to be able to stem the border crossings with these Islamists, first of all, they don't have it. And second of all, that influence that they have from these outsiders is going to make it even more difficult. These open borders have created issues over the last few decades. And the instability that's caused is another reason why we're in this situation. Number 3, the Islamic Connection. Now, this one I want to be very careful with because I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to insult my Islamic brothers and sisters. But the truth is, indigenous groups have lived amongst Christians and Muslims for years, up until recently. For those of you who've heard this story, when I was in Mali, and I was going to travel from the Dogon area to what they call the Dogon area, the area Banyagra, which is around Mopti area of Mali, center of Mali. And I was going to travel to Timbuktu. Back in the day, you could go by water, you could take a train. I think you could take a train. You could do all of this, but now you can't do it anymore. And usually the main issue at the time was the Islamists coming in from the north, who were creating instability. But all of a sudden, the night I was there, we're supposed to leave the following morning. I get told by a friend of mine who works with local communities there. He's like, look, now the Dogon people are fighting against the people from this part of the world. And it's interesting what he said to me. He said, these people have lived with each other for centuries, if not thousands of years. And all of a sudden, they're fighting over ideological differences to do with politics and so on. So what I'm saying is this global, if you will, jihadi movement itself, even when you look at it from the places that it started from, Iraq, Iran, so-called Middle East, etc., it's also created for the same reasons that we have these issues in West Africa. The reasons why these coups have been created are the same reason that these jihadi movements have been started as well. Just look at the volunteers, the young men and women that go from Europe to go and join these Islamic groups and then go and commit acts of terror. These people that become extremists. Now, why do they do it? They do it because they feel marginalized in their society. They do it because they live in maybe impoverished communities. And then all it takes for them, you already feel isolated. All it takes is for a charismatic leader to step in and tell you, you know what, you are better. The Quran says this, or this one says this. You see it in Ireland with the IRA. They took a lot of young charismatic, these charismatic leaders were able to lure these young men who felt marginalized and said, we're going to bring you in and we're going to try and ensure that you go and feel like you are worth something. Go and die for something. But the root of the matter is they live in impoverished communities. They feel marginalized. It's the same thing that we're seeing in Mali today, in Niger today, in Guinea today. In many parts of Africa, these people feel marginalized and they either go and commit acts of crime or they try and leave the country. So socio-economical issues are the number one reason that we see any sort of major conflict like this, any religious conflict or social ideological conflict in some ways. Religion is also important in this part of the world, but it's not the main reason for the coups. Again, I want to make that absolutely clear. It's not the reason for the coups. Okay, people from the Sahel region historically have fought, wars amongst each other. Some of them have fought in the name of religion. Some of them have also fought just simply because they wanted to remove bad leadership. If you know the story of Usman Dan Fodio is a man who in the 1800s came back from Mecca in Saudi Arabia, felt a passion for his religion, and was committed to ensure that people in this part of West Africa, the region I'm talking about is Nigeria, northern part of Nigeria, Niger, and Mali, and so, no, not Mali, but Niger, what would be part of Burkina Faso today. He wanted to ensure that those people became Muslim by force. Now, obviously, he didn't like the way things were being done before, and he eventually took huge control of many parts of that part of Western Africa. And it's actually one of the major reasons why in Nigeria, if you look at where Islam got to, it got to what you would call the first. So you have the north and northeastern part is largely Islamic, and then it sort of jumps over the middle belt and goes to the southwest. So you have Yoruba speaking Muslim people. That's largely down to the conquest of Usman Dan Fodio. So you have people like this who did it in the name of Islam. But what we're seeing in this region is a commonality in Islam, but it's not the major reason why this conflict has occurred. Let me keep moving, please. I don't want to spend too long. I want to get to questions and points. Shout out to Abs Hashmi on Instagram. Love your work, brother, from Australia. Thank you so much. Blessings. Appreciate that. Thank you. Number 4, growing insecurity in the region. Okay, these 2 points, the points I just made are pretty connected, but bombings we've seen in the region, terrorism, of course, and that's led to more French involvement. You see, the French troops only just left some parts of these regions, some parts of this region a few years in the last year. Mali. If you watch the film Timbuktu by the great filmmaker Abdurrahman Sissoko. Abdurrahman Sissoko is a filmmaker from Mali/Mauritania, and he made a film about the occupation of Timbuktu by the jihadis and how the French were moving imminently. I also tell you my story of arriving in Timbuktu. Seems like I have too many stories, right? But I remember my story of arriving in Timbuktu. The day I left, they blew up the whole airport, killing French and ECOWAS soldiers, ironically. But this is something that's still going on today. And, we may not hear it in as much in the news, but it's something which is an existential threat. Now, remember, oil and other resources are being discovered in this part of the world. So this, wherever there's a resource that's being found, people have a reason to go there. There's the famous thing about Rwanda. Rwanda had no real major resource that the West wanted. And so because of that, they just allowed people to kill each other. Again, the death of Gaddafi and the opening up of Libya to, rogue, traders, criminals, bringing in terrorism, bringing in weapons, that has created additional amount of insecurity in this region. And then, of course, when we talk about the trans-Saharan migration through very, very porous borders that exist. And for those of you on my channel, there's a short film I made called Tafia, which is about Nigerians going from northern Nigeria into Niger to try and migrate to Europe. Check it out. Just touches a little bit on this topic. But these porous borders, that border right across the northern part of Nigeria that goes into Niger is one of the most unmanned borders you will find. For those of you who have ever driven, who have ever tried to go from Nigeria into Benin, which is the country to the west of Nigeria, there are some ways in, but that's a guarded, heavily guarded border. But there are ways in, there are ways around it. People now go by boat on the Atlantic Ocean. Imagine that northern border, close to that hot northern border. All right. Now, the last point I wanted to bring up on when we deal with the commonality is West Africa under military rule. That's not a very good explanation. What I mean by that is the Sudan area is under military rule. Again, earlier I talked to you guys about the region once being part of what was called the Sudan area. So you had, if you know the history of the region, you had three great empires that really controlled this particular part of the world. Actually, four. You had the Empire of Ghana, which is really called Empire of Ouagadougou. Then you have the Empire of Mali, which is where you get, for those people, everybody knows about the Mansa, whose name Mansa Kanka Musa. And then you have the Songhai Empire. Songhai Empire made way for the Kanem Bornu Empire just to the east of it, which is where you have Niger and Chad today. So it's ironic, if you go over the last 1,500 years in West Africa's history, this whole region that I'm talking about had some of the greatest empires post-Egypt. It's so ironic that this same poor region of Africa today that is under military rulership was once controlled the gold, the cotton trade of that part of Africa. It was so influential in world history. Timbuktu, which was part of the Mali and Songhai Empire, was a center for learning that was known around the world. It's so ironic that now they are among the poorest countries, and also they are the area which is seen as part of this military-controlled area. It's also the gateway to North Africa. It's the borderline to the Sahara Desert, okay? So this is, again, not a coincidence. It is not a coincidence. All right, I've got a couple more slides, and then I'm gonna take some of your points. So, guys, keep the questions coming. Keep the super chats coming, guys. Appreciate the tuning in, but we need to back it. So the foreign actors, I think, is where we really, really, really start to see why this is happening and in what ways that it's happening. So Africa, really, if you look at what's going on, certainly if you watch the news, if you're on social media and you see some of the things that African leaders are saying, you will quickly see that Africa is moving away from Western influence, whether they like it or not. I've been somebody who's been talking about how power is shifting east. Some people have argued with me about it, but you only have to just open your eyes and you can see it for yourself. Now let's deal with the West. Now, historically, when it comes to Africa, the EU, the US, Britain, actually, I keep saying the EU and US, but Britain used to be part of the EU. So EU, the Britain, US, Western countries in general, European countries in general, have always dealt with us as if we were beggars. They talk to us with no respect. The IMF, the World Bank, structural adjustment program that they gave to us, the way they give us aid is a lack of respect. Even in many ways today, they still treat us, well, not many ways, they still treat us with a lack of respect. You have to watch the recent US-Africa summit. For those of you who paid attention to it, Biden was trying to emulate what Obama did in 2014. So Biden goes and does it, but look at him. The man had no agenda. You go and invite 49 heads of state from Africa, and there's no agenda to discuss. No agenda. Kamala Harris goes and does a tour of some countries in Africa, goes to Ghana, and her focus is to tell Ghanaians that you people need to accept homosexuality on this continent. Can you imagine? With everything we've got going on in the world, you come to try and preach to us that we should accept homosexuality. So Africans are getting fed up of the disrespect. Absolutely fed up. Go and watch the Paris summit that was on, when was that, in June? The Paris Africa Summit, if that's what they officially call it. Now, Emmanuel Macron was left embarrassed. It didn't go as planned. I think you only have to look and see some of the comments by South African presidents and various others. It didn't go as planned. This man he had formulated this thing because obviously a lot of these people all recognize what's going on, and they're trying to hold on to Africa because of all these resources. So they're all trying to say, "Oh no, they're still my boys. They're still my boys. No. These are my new friends. No. You know." So Macron, it backfired for him. It really backfired. And before I move on from that, let's just deal with the US again. US corruption. You know, it's US had this way of using a very intelligent way of describing how their government is, the complexities. But now it's just showing itself the way we've seen our own corruption. You look at the Trump election. On the one hand, they're saying, "Oh, Trump stole the election." You know, they're saying that he needs to go to court. The same thing that we're talking about in Nigeria, right? The Labour Party is going to court to say that the current president stole his election. But Trump has already served his 4 years. You only have to go back to the Bush-Gore thing. Bush-Gore, 2000 election in the United States. Remember what happened with Bush and Gore? They managed to masquerade that as if there was no corruption whatsoever. They made it seem like, oh no, it's just the recount, Florida. I mean, that's corruption. And now Africans are starting to open their eyes and see that Western credibility is shot to bits. And the common African is starting to see that, let alone the politicians. The common everyday African is starting to see that this is BS. You guys are hypocrites. Now, if you even remember the coups that used to happen of old, right? Let's just focus on the French, so-called Francophone part of Africa. France would usually be a major backer or rejecter of the new regime. Again, we talked about Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara took over. He didn't check with France, I don't think. But as soon as France saw, okay, this guy's not what we need him to do, he's not doing what I asked him to do, they got his number two to kill him, right? When there is a Leopold Sédar Senghor was basically stealing, if you want to call those elections. You look at Paul Biya in Cameroon. You have a man who's been in power for 43 years, 42, 43 years, in a country which was once part English, part French in terms of colonies. There will be elections that are, if you remember that famous election in 2016, where there was an election that he won 100% of the votes in that region, but there was no election that took place there. Like the people didn't even vote. France is backing them still. So now all of a sudden, they have a new competitor. A competitor who actually looks them in the eye and talks to them with a little bit more respect and does deals with them. He doesn't say, hey, look, we've been friends since 1800s. Oh, no, we've had a relationship for a long time. It's complex, but we're family. No, the Chinese will come in and say, okay, you need an airport? I'll give you the airport. And you know what? Don't pay me for the airport. So now what happens is if you discover oil, now China already knows you have oil, but when you discover the oil, they say, you know what, China, you did us a favor. If you want to come and let's do a deal on this oil, come and extract it for us, right? And then, of course, aside from China, you have Russia. Russia, in a way you could look at, if there's any European nation, and I use the term European because Europe isn't really a continent, but you know what I mean by Europe. It's really Eurasia, and Russia is part of the Asian side of Europe. Partly part of the Asian side of Europe. Russia has actually been an ally in many cases of Africa through Cuba, but an ally. Soviets came in and helped in Congo when Patrice Lumumba was looking for help. Nobody wanted, the French, the Belgians, the Americans, nobody wanted to come and help him. Even the UN disrespected him. And what happened? He called the Soviets. And that was essentially the end of it, right? So you have China and Russia who are new actors who look people in the eye and say, I'll do a deal with you. And then let's not forget, Russia and China are part of BRICS. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. These are the new emerging, so you have what they call developing states, you have developed states, and then you have these emerging states like BRICS, who are now starting to come together and form their own bloc. South Africa, Russia, China. Happen to also be, in terms of landmass, in terms of Russia and China, two of the biggest countries in the world. I think Canada is the second biggest in the world, and then you have Russia and China, something like that. And I think it's bigger. Yeah, Russia and China, I think, something like that. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But the point is, influence they have. So we see the hypocrisy of, and also Africans are also, they're not stupid. We see the hypocrisy of the Russian condemnation of the Ukraine conflict. Don't forget, last year, March 2022, there was a war that Russia invaded Ukraine. And the Western point of view was against these innocent people who have done nothing wrong, who have been bullied by this big neighbor. And all of a sudden, it's creating friction. It's created, obviously, friction in Europe, where most people have sided with the Ukrainian side, with the Western point of view. And then in other parts of the world, they said, no, business as usual. Russia, you ain't done nothing to me. I recognize that the issue that you have with Ukraine is an age-old problem between brothers and sisters. So you guys do your thing. It's none of my business. Obviously, they would prefer peace, but it is something that people accept. So now let me just deal with the Russian side quickly, okay? Let me deal with the Russian side. My bad. I moved slides too quick. Now we see, if you look, for those of you who saw the footage of the coup in Niger, you quickly saw that Russian flags were being waved in Niamey, the capital. We saw Russian flags. People were waving Russian flags after the military had taken over. We've seen this before also in Mali, by the way. We saw it a few years ago in Central African Republic. You look at that same Paris Africa summit last month, okay? And it will just show you how uninterested Africans are in France now in comparison to how we used to be. The Western anti-Russia sentiment has drawn Africans closer to Russia. They almost see Russia as an underdog, but we need to be careful. And I have to emphasize this, okay? We need to be careful with how Russia is going about their things. We need to be careful. But Russia is smart. Russia, was it 2 days ago, or was it yesterday? They wiped out $23 billion worth of debt for Africa. Very intelligent with the way that they're doing things. So African people will look at them. Just remember the Russia-Africa summit. The president of Burkina Faso, that young guy, I call him the young Sankara, the guy with the red beret, Ibrahim Traore. He said Russia is like family to Africans. Right? Now, okay, let's be careful. Let's not talk too much about that. But Russia, we know Russia, their involvement in Africa. They were at the Berlin conference when what they call the Scramble for Africa, where Africa was being divided, but they didn't get apart. Okay, there's reasons for that. But let's not bring that up. That'll just be another topic for another day. Even the fact that we have a Russia-Africa summit is indicative of the fact that Russia's influence in Africa is growing. It's not quite to the level of China, but it's growing. You've had two of them. I think the last one was in 2019, and then we've just had one in 2013. So Africans are moving generally away from the West. Russia is preparing a NATO versus Russia-China front, if you will, in Africa. And we have to be very careful about this. There is this strip of land, this Sahel region, this divide of military rulership. You have the North, which has connections to Europe, and then you have the South, which has connections to South Africa and BRICS, if you will, right? But there is also this unexplained thing which is going on, where you see that there's a front being created with Russia and China, their influence in Africa. Chinese involvement has grown significantly since 1960 in Africa. There are very few airports you will go to, very few train stations you will go to now that haven't been built in the last 5 years that didn't have Chinese involvement. And then, of course, there's the Wagner Group. Shout out, give me a 1 if you know what the Wagner Group is. The Wagner Group essentially is a paramilitary Russian group. When I say paramilitary, I mean this is a well-organized, what was the movie we're talking about? The Wild Geese. You look at the movie The Wild Geese, for instance, about those British paramilitaries who were hired, mercenaries essentially. But the Wagner Group is an organized private army. Now, that's a real military who could step in and assist Africans and Soviets, I say Soviets, and Russians during the new Cold War, if you will. The new Cold War, in the same way that the Soviets supported Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Congo, Zaire, through Cuba during the 1960s and the 1970s. So the Wagner Group is a real thing. And I advise anybody, if you want to study more on this topic, go and find out what the Wagner Group is involved in Belarus and various parts of the world that they're involved in, and try and understand that this thing, obviously everything is strategic. Everybody wants to go for resources. Resources are key, and Africa is the breadbasket of the world. So let's be careful. Nothing in this world is free. The military takeover was in some ways backed by Russia or the Wagner. These soldiers will not take over if they didn't have some sort of westernized or some sort of foreign power backing them. The Wagner Group, I'm pretty sure, it's my opinion, gave them the okay to go and do what they did. And that's also the reason why the West, with all the influence that they have in the Sahel, with the armies and so on, the AFRICOM and so on, the French troops that are there and so on, it's the reason why they haven't done anything. Yes, they're doing it through ECOWAS and so on, but they haven't physically gone and done anything because they recognize that Russia / the Wagner Group is a real adversary. We need to work with people who benefit us. African people, we need to work with people who benefit us. For once, let's do it. And know when to say no. Because Russia can easily come and be like a France, can easily come and be like a Britain. Outsiders, you're welcome to come and help, all right? But remember that you are an outsider. My young brother from Burkina Faso, the president, who says that they're like family to Africans, maybe that's politics, maybe that's naivete, I don't know. But there's a Swahili proverb that says, treat a guest as a guest for just 2 days. But when you get to the third day, you give him a hoe. In other words, he's a guest for a couple of days and then make him work. Make him work for it. Make him go and work in the farm with you. And I think we have to be very careful that we don't see these people coming and saying, okay, you're God to us. You're a new God. We have to look them in the eye and stay looking them in the eye and know when to say no to them. Okay. Coming up to the end, I just want to rush through this quickly and then we'll get to the questions. 1 hour 22. Okay, not bad. So why is the military more impactful than the ballot? Talking specifically in Africa here, okay? Talking specifically in Africa. And you can make an argument that even in the Western world, the ballot isn't as powerful as, say, somebody with a strong arm. But the military, at least in Africa, let's just talk about Africa. Let's talk about this part of Africa, for instance, with all the corruption that's going on. The military is the last disciplined sector of any government. You have civil servants who work in ministries and so on, and you hear of corruption going on everywhere in the world, by the way, not just in Africa. But the military, for the most part, I'm not saying there's no nepotism there, I'm not saying anything else, but for the most part, it's not based on nepotism, but on merit. A man comes in as a private and ends up as a general, even if when he got to, colonel level, he was quickly upgraded because his friend was the president. Fine. But from private to lieutenant, he must have done something. He must have done something. In fact, J.J. Rawlings, late head of state of Ghana, who actually died in 2021 after going to Mali to talk when the first coup happened, coincidentally. He said this. He said, if the people are crushed by their elites, it is up to the army to give the people their freedom. Hear what I'm saying? If the people are crushed by their elites, it is up to the army to give the people their freedom. So the military is in a strategic place where they can usher in social changes and also see that it gets done for the most part. Okay. In Africa, the military provides, for us anyway, an alternative to democracy. And it's an alternative to democracy that's more akin to life prior to colonialism. We recognize it. We recognize a strong, I hate the word warrior, but we recognize a strong leader, a strong king going into battle and coming back and saying, no, this is how things are going to be done. For those of us who grew up in West Africa, I mean, I remember we used to drive from Nigeria to Benin to Togo to go to school. And all three countries were military controlled, all of them. So military checkpoints, etc. But under the military, even in a place like Nigeria, for example, you were more afraid of the soldiers stopping you on the police than being kidnapped by a thief or robber. Because if the army caught you, the army would deal with you with a strong hand. You'll be hung. Go on YouTube and see how the military used to deal with thieves back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. They'd hang them at Bar Beach. That's in Nigeria. So the army is something we recognize because it's more similar to our leadership style in Africa, at least in some parts, where a leader is not based on nepotism, but based on strength of character, strength of ability in war, in battle. The military the military has shown the ability to overlook ethnic and religious differences. Again, I'm not saying this is a rule across the board. I'm just saying for the most part, unlike politicians, okay? Politicians tend to focus on, who is my ally, which ethnic group is my ally. Sometimes they do. I'm not saying all the time, but historically, this is what we've seen. They focus on those sorts of differences to create schisms and issues amongst the people in order to win votes, right? It happens all over the world, by the way. Donald Trump won his election by catering to a particular ethnicity in America, if you will. When I say ethnicity, I mean not just race, but socioeconomic ethnicity in that sense. So we recognize it in Africa and we embrace it. You look in Mali, for instance. Mali just decided to drop the French language as the national language. So the military is showing the ability to say, you know what, let's focus on what the people need. Okay. Now, anyway, I'll get to it in a second. But the military has to be a temporary solution. Because the military, at least the current iteration of the military, the way the military looks today, it is still shaped in the mold of the Western army. It's not as if this is the army of the Emperor of Songhai. It's not the same military structure. It's the Westernized structure of, you have the private, the corporal, the sergeant, the lieutenant, the major, colonel, whatever, right? The ranking system, the way it's done. Now, we're not talking about how it was created. I'm just talking about we took their style. So in that sense alone, it's hard to continue to practice it and say indigenous. Now, if any of these militaries stay, by the way, they will eventually fail. We've already seen it, by the way. You'll continue to see, if these guys choose to keep staying without any sort of plan ahead, and even when they don't stick to the plan, you will start seeing counter coups. There will be another coup. Another army man will think, I'm better than this guy, I could do the job. He'll go and make the same promises, suspend the constitution, do the exact same thing. We saw a counter coup in Mali in 2021. Go back to 2012, we saw counter coups happening for the last decade in Mali. I think we saw, did we see a counter coup in Guinea? I think. I can't remember. No, not Guinea. Where was it that we saw a counter coup? I can't remember now. I can't remember. But anyway, historically, when the military doesn't have a long-term plan, they basically become despotic leaders. The people eventually rebel against them too. In the same way that people are rebelling against democracy. This isn't necessarily a style of government that's being rebelled against. It's the fact that people's needs are not being met. They are not being met. Libya lived under a military ruler for the best part of 3-4 decades. There was no real rebellion. Now, it's not to say that people weren't being treated badly, but go and find out from people about how people lived in Libya. I never was there, so I wouldn't even say to myself that I'm an authority on it. But for 4 decades. It's at least beckons the question that how were things there that people felt for 4 decades that there's no need to do anything about it. Ultimately, the people must decide the sorts of government that they want, but there must be a direction. The Arab Spring, if you see so-called Arab Spring, what happened in northern part of Africa in 2011, it created even more confusion in the region. More confusion, more, and it destabilized it even more. Okay. I'm on my last 2 slides now. So let me just quickly shout out to my people. Wow, loads of comments. I'll get back to them in a minute. Guys, hit the like button. Please, please, please hit the like button before. Shout out to my Instagram people who's still there. Thank you. Good to see you. Hit the like button, please. Right, the need for an African Renaissance, and over there you can see the picture on the right, on the left rather, is it's to be found in Dakar. It's almost like it's very symbolic. Anybody who's been to Dakar, Senegal, it's very big part of the town near the coast. You could see that image, which symbolizes essentially the power of the African family, unity. And on the right, you have a book by a man called Amilcar Cabral. For those of you who know Amilcar Cabral, he was leader of the PAIGC, which is the Guinea-Bissau / Cape Verdean, I guess you call it a political party in a ways, but largely a movement to try and end the Portuguese reign in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, but also in Mozambique and Angola, etc. Amilcar Cabral is the leader of that group. He was assassinated in Guinea, coincidentally, in the 1970s. Never actually saw his country independent, but he was an amazing writer, and he wrote a book called The Return to the Source. And I leave that there because I want you guys to try and see if you could find an English version. Eddie De Brito, my brother, shout out to you. Eddie De Brito is Cape Verdean, good friend of mine, so he knows about this man. And I think those of you who want to study a little bit more on this topic, you need to go on this. Have I been off this whole time? Oh my God, have I been off this whole time? My bad. That's terrible. That is terrible. Okay, let's let me do this. Oh man, I've been off this whole time. That's a shame. I'm sorry. All right. So let me do this. All right. Let me do this. Okay. Let me keep moving. So I've been off this whole time. My bad, people. I didn't realize. Anyway, I hope you weren't put off by all the slides. I'm sort of looking at my notes at the same time. All right. So returning to the source. So there is a desperate need today in 2023 for us Africans, right, to have some sort of economic, cultural, political renaissance. Okay, when I say that, I mean that we need to switch back on. We need to switch back on and go back to the things that make us African in the first place. What I'm saying is, and there's a proverb that says, if there is no enemy within, the enemy outside cannot harm us. If there is no enemy within, the enemy outside cannot harm us. We need to continue to reject the role of our former colonial, I hate the word masters, but colonial leaders. In our everyday lives, in our politics, we need to reject the role that they play in our lives. My brother, who I've quoted a lot, says we all have an imaginary European person in our head, and it is our job as African people every day that we live to ensure that we remove this imaginary European from our head. One, we can start with the currency. That's a practical thing that we could do first straight off the bat. Get rid of the currency. Find a uniform currency that we can use that is tied to the resources and the wealth of the continent. We need to begin to form our African cultural identity. That is ultimately what is going to inform what we do, what we say, even how we govern ourselves. Because there's no point saying we're going to have election every 4 years, every 5 years, every 7 years. We're going to write the constitution, blah, 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 if the people are not taking it seriously. Look, the Middle East, so-called Middle East, the Arab states in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Peninsula, they're becoming more competitive today because Islamic culture, not the religion, but the culture, is the driving force behind it. Whereas if you compare them to, say, the more liberal democracy that is practiced in Northern Africa, with the exception of Morocco, you'll see that it's not working there because they're practicing something that is not tied to their culture politically. So you see the issues going on in that part of the world, not just the issues economically, but even culturally. You know, China is a competitive country under the socialist system because to account for all the numerous ethnicities in a nation of 2 billion people, however much the population is, you need to account for them somehow by having a system that, for the most part, I'm not saying it's perfect, but for the most part, embraces their own cultures, or at least shuns out Western culture. At least we can say that. You see, but we in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, we will fight for Islam, we will fight for Christianity, but when it comes to Shongo, when it comes to Vodun, when it comes to Ngai, when it comes to, what's the one in Congo, Nzambi Pungu, we will shun them. We will ridicule them. We will say this is witchcraft. We will say this is juju. But when it comes to the things that are not indigenous to our place, we will embrace them hook, line, and sinker. We will swear an oath on the Bible or the Quran, yet we will not believe truly in what it's saying, because they at times, both Islam and Christianity have some contradictions with our innate cultural beliefs as African people. You strip away those religions from our place, and how would we behave? Go and look at the examples that exist all across Africa of how people live amongst themselves without the need for any religion, but just a creed of common understanding of human decency. I'm talking of rural places. Go and look at the San people. Go and look at rural Kikuyu and Maasai people. We will accept historical books, textbooks in our schools from the West, and not even try and teach our children the history, our true history. We will rather let them use the book. Imagine a head of state saying that the books that we have teach are good enough for our students. Imagine a minister of education saying something like that the books that we have, but your people are still running to try and leave. Your students are still trying to leave, and at the same time, you're not even paying for the universities to stay open. We in Africa, we will promote English, we will promote French, we will promote Arabic, we will promote Spanish, Portuguese, but we will ignore the fact that in East Africa, you have 200 plus million people, 1/5 of the population of the continent in East Africa speaking Kiswahili, 60 million people speaking Lingala in Central Africa, 40 million people speaking Yoruba, probably like 100 million people speaking Hausa, probably another 50 million people speaking Fulani, another like 35 million people speaking Igbo. Then you have Tamazight and all the languages of the Berbers, like 40-something languages. You will ignore all of that and just say, no, in Africa, we speak English, French, Arabic, Portuguese, Spanish, and whatever other language. I mean, it's ridiculous. English and Afrikaans should really be outlawed in South Africa. It should be outlawed. When you have that many Zulu and Xhosa speakers, why do you need English and Afrikaans? When that many people speak the language, what is the need to have English being taught in schools? Maybe as a second language. We don't promote regionalism. We promote the outside world. We promote the outside world. We don't promote what is happening next door to us. Why is it? About 8 years ago in Ghana, they said that they wanted to bring French as a compulsory language at the JSS level, that's junior secondary school level, compulsory. With all the languages being spoken in Ghana, they said the reason why is because, we're surrounded by French-speaking countries. The truth of the matter is, if you go to those so-called French-speaking countries, does everyone speak French to the standard that you will call an educated level of French? No. But the indigenous languages that you have in common, Ghana is bordering with Ivory Coast. Ghana borders with Togo. They have languages like the Ewe language, for example, they share with Togo, right? They have Mandinka that they share with places in not Mandinka. They have what's the language I'm thinking about? But anyway, they have languages that they share across the border. Why not say, okay, in this part of Ghana, because you're close to Ivory Coast, learn this language so that you can speak with your brothers across the border. In this part of Ghana, learn this language so you can speak the same language as the people in Togo, so you can share with your brothers and sisters. We don't think like that. We promote the outside world. It's all about the outside world. Until we start embracing our regional identity, even if things stabilize, we will soon find ourselves with military takeovers all over the continent, and at least a second Cold War on African soil. A second Cold War on African soil is destined to come our way. Because don't forget, the first Cold War, they said, was a war of what? A war of words between the West and the Soviets. But where was the playground? Where were people getting killed? They were getting killed in Africa and South America, Central America. That's where people were dying during the Cold War. They may not have died in Europe or America. There may have been threats of bombs and all this type of stuff. But really, up until 1990, the places that people were dying because of their association with the Soviets or the West, whatever, is in Africa and South America. So the question is, if we don't want another second war, another Cold War on African soil with the bloodshedding of fellow Africans, if we don't want our land to be taken away from us, we need to start embracing a regional identity. Liberal democracy, however you want to look at it, has failed in Africa. However you want to look at it. I'm not saying we don't need some sort of democracy. I'm just saying liberal democracy in the current way that it exists has failed us in Africa. Absolutely failed us. We need another one, another form of government that aligns with our conservative social culture. It's why we've it's why we've rejected the all the legal framework that exists for stopping coups. See, in the West, they believe in their constitutions. They live by it. But in Africa, nobody cares about this stuff. It's not worth the paper it's written on, because our constitutions mean nothing to us. We don't need something written down in the model of somebody else's culture to say to us that this is how we're supposed to be. We don't need it. In Igbo, there's an Igbo proverb that says, unity is strength. Gidi gidi bu gweze. Like, unity is strength. Unity is strength. And I want to just end, oh my God, I've quite a few comments. I want to just end quickly by just bringing up one last point, which is a warning to Tinubu and ECOWAS. Okay, this is my last point, and I'm going to take your questions and go through the additional slides. Tinubu, as I said, is the current president of Nigeria and the chair of ECOWAS. He's the person leading the delegation. When I say leading, not physically, but he's the person in charge of what happens, what ECOWAS does next in Niger. Nigeria is the so-called giant of Africa, right? At some point, we're going to have to prove it, right? You see, the US, like them or not, has the audacity to go wherever they want and bully whoever they want, because they're the giants. Well, at least they have been, let's put it that way. Nigeria, if you want to be considered the giant of Africa, you make a threat that we're not going to rule out military intervention. You give these people 7 days. You know they're not going to comply. So now you have to really you need to start considering taking military action, right? Now, keep in mind, Bola Ahmed Tinubu is contested a very dubious election in February of this year, won the election, which is still in court, didn't get the required majority. So you can already imagine what Niger, our biggest border country, our biggest border country to the north of us, what the people over there are saying, is it you that's going to come and dictate to me what I should do next when you yourself are illegitimate? The cost of ECOWAS going into Niger right now is something which Nigeria is going to have to bear bear the brunt of it, right? Despite it being, we're in a recession in Nigeria. You have all sorts of political disagreements following the elections. You have, we have another brain drain. People are jackbuying, people are leaving. The background of extreme corruption that we have in Nigeria. Look at Kenya, for instance. Kenya recently, they had a similar thing. They had this very contested election. William Ruto won. But even in all the chaos of that, there's a problem in the Congo. They sent troops there. And I heard today that they'd sent police to Haiti to help with management of the situation over there. They sent police to Haiti, 1,000 police officers to Haiti, and troops to Congo, despite the fact that they are going through this turmoil economically. They're proving that they're giants in that part of the world. Are we, Nigeria, stable enough to do the same? And by the way, ECOWAS, when it comes to intervention, ECOWAS has not been historically great at intervention. Okay. But, again, if Nigeria and ECOWAS if ECOWAS in particular wants to be proven to be a big boy, if Nigeria wants to be proven to be a big boy, we need to go and show it. If we really want to be giants, we have some of the most porous borders. If you look at the border in Niger, that's one thing. Look at the border with Cameroon. It's also pretty porous. But Niger is obviously the worst. We are already fighting Boko Haram. We are already fighting IPOB, the indigenous people of Biafra, who are trying to create a separate state in the southeast of the country. We're facing banditry. We're facing God knows what else. Can you imagine if ECOWAS goes into Niger with Nigerian troops? Just think of the danger that will create in Nigeria. Just think about it. And then it will also open Nigeria up to its own coups, by the way. Because the situation in Nigeria, it's not as if you ask a Nigerian, how do you like the country, that you'll find 10 people who are not paid by the government to say that it's great. Everybody will say that this country is terrible to live in, both wealthy and rich and poor alike. Imagine Nigeria goes to the capital city of capital city of Niger, which is Niamey, and starts bombing the place and shooting things down. It will be catastrophic for Nigeria. Bola Tinubu, by the way, I also don't think is stable enough to do what both the West wants, which is go and deal with Russia and China in Africa for us. Make sure you take care of them so that they don't have any more influence. And so therefore, I think ECOWAS has no choice but to approach this in a diplomatic way. And more importantly, avoid the blood of innocent people being shed. It has to stop. All right. So that was my last slide, my people. I apologize again because earlier I was not on screen. So I'm pretty sure that was quite off-putting, just seeing a slide and hearing a voice. Let me go back and read some of your comments. Guys, hit the like button. Please, 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 if you're here, just hit the like button. Hit the like button before you go or whatever. All right, so let's go back through some of your comments. And if you've got any questions, anybody wants to jump on as well, let me know. I can send you a link. Actually, let me do this. Let me send the link in the chat. If there's anybody that wants to jump on the conversation, we'll do it for the last like 12 minutes. There's the link if you need to jump on. Okay, so Liz, France Afrique is okay. So the Arabs and Islam was the first users of imperialism in Africa. Asia has been as dangerous since the Hyksos of Kemet. Excellent. Flaunting. Okay. A tropical dependency was the first time I saw West Africa being called Sudan. Very good point. A tropical dependency. Lizzie, I hear you, but hugging up Putin can be just as dangerous, and we already know how China rolls. Yep, I mean, that's true in theory. Again, don't trust anybody. But, we live in a world where you have to use people. You have to use people for your own economic benefit. These people don't like us, but they use us. In the same way, we should use them. Use them to get get what it is we need to get to, but don't be limited. There's a very famous clip of Nelson Mandela after he had been released from prison, and I think he came to the United States and he was being interviewed by somebody, and they were talking to him about Gaddafi. And Gaddafi, for those of you who don't know, Gaddafi was a major supporter of Mkoto Wesizwe, which is the armed military group that Mandela was part of, and eventually, of course, the ANC. And the person said, "Oh, so why do you support? Was it Gaddafi? Sorry, was it Gaddafi? Yeah, Gaddafi, I think it was, and also Fidel Castro, who's another major backer of his." And he said, the biggest mistake you people in the West make is that you think that your enemies should be our enemies. And that's a powerful, profound statement. Profound statement. For instance, my people here who are from Lusophone Africa, Portuguese-speaking Africa, you know what Cuba has done. Cuba sent its own troops to fight for your independence. A lot of them were African troops, of course, black troops from Cuba, but it doesn't really matter. Fidel Castro, this sworn enemy of the West, who has been dead for a number of years now, but there are still sanctions against his country because of what he did all the way back in 1959. This man is still being dealt with because he supported the Soviets and used the Soviets' influence to work on to help liberate Africa and various parts of South America and Latin America. There's a very good documentary made by a friend of mine called Jihan El Tahri, Egyptian filmmaker. She made it. It's called Cuba, An African Odyssey. If you want to find out Cuba's involvement in Africa, go and watch that documentary. Maybe you might find it on YouTube. Cuba, An African Odyssey. Here we go. I don't have a problem in doing business with Russia, but keep them at arm's length. Exactly. Don't let them in the back rooms. Exactly. Organic African paradigm. I'm curious if France treated them with respect, but still exploit, would that be less of a problem? I think I understand your question, but I think it should be pretty self-explanatory. It's not so much the fact about treating them with, you don't exploit people. The minute you exploit somebody, you're disrespecting them, regardless of whether you say, "Hi, please, can I steal this off you?" or you stab them and then take it off them. Either way, it's exploitation. Once you exploit a people and then don't treat them as equals, they will eventually start to hate you and rebel against you. Nobody wants to be treated like they're less than human. Eventually, they will grow up, if not them, but their children will grow up and say, "I'm not tolerating this." Russia is just as imperialist, just smarter and more responsible in diplomacy than America. Yeah, and I think also America has done far more deeds around the world publicly that, it's easy to see that what they, the evidence of you only have to go to South America, you only have to go to, parts of Africa, you don't go to Russia, you just go to Japan, everywhere, Vietnam, everybody has a legacy of America somewhere. Everybody has a legacy of what America's done in the last 100 years. Haiti, in a way. Russia is not one to waste an opportunity to be a thorn in the West's side. Putin is uptight over Ukraine and needs a win somewhere. That's another way of looking at it. I'm not going to lie. That's a very good point. Necessary evil, unfortunately. The Wagner Group is the only group capable and willing to train Africa to fight against Western forces. Again, Mr. Siad is clued up. The Wagner Group, if you wanted to find out more about Russia and its paramilitary, its private army, you will find out Wagner would be a good place to start so that you understand exactly the influence that they have around the world. But the question is, after the dust settles, how do we ensure the country's wealth gets passed down to the people? No matter who sits at the top, civilian or military, the corruption and lack of accountability persist. Okay, so just to answer that question, I think you have to build institutions. Paul Kagame is always talking about this. Build institutions. You have to build institutions. There's no way to get around it. If you are going to ensure that a country is able to go forward, institutions have to be built. The reason why you can have, take the UK, for example. In the UK, in the last 7 years, you've had 1, 2, 3, something like 5 prime ministers. But yes, the economy has suffered a little bit, but for the most part, there's a cushion landing somewhere because the civil service has been built. The National Health Service has been built for the most part. Things run. The civil service can run the economy even though there's no head of state. Technically, I mean that I'm obviously generalizing. But in Africa, from one regime to another, you're worried. From one regime to another, you're worried. I'm not everywhere has seamless transition. Some people just have had one leader. Again, take the Togo example. You had president who was leading since the 1960s. 2005, his son took over. Foreign Nasimbe took over from his father, Eyadema. What's the guy in Gabon? Ali Bongo Odinga. His father was the president since independence. In 2005, when the father died, he took over. He's been the president for the last nearly 20 years. So, whether it's seamless transition or not, how well are things improving? There are no institutions that have been built. Mark, my brother, revolution isn't rebellion. There's a difference between those inside African militaries rebelling against the current structures and a grassroots guerrilla uprising by the masses of the people. Okay. Institution building and industrialization must come after military coup. Sorry, institution building and industrialization must come after the military coup. Yep. Empower the people to control themselves before the military brass. Before the military brass gets out of control. You look at the situation in Guinea, for example. This guy, this head of state, who his wife is, he was part of the wife's part of the Foreign Legion. He himself is basically a Frenchman in that sense. If he starts to do something of value, but he seems like he's getting too comfortable in that position, because I know somebody like him. And by the way, not all of these militaries that are taking over are doing it with the kind of, not all the militaries, not all these actors are doing this with the best interest of the people. Some of them are actually, either secret or hidden, either Wagner guys or hidden French guys. Hidden, one of them, either Wagner or French at this point. Yeah. So, all right, where are we going? Keep the comments coming. I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes. If Africa would use its relationship with the diaspora, it could even influence the European countries in Africa's interests. Exactly. Okay. It'll be a human disaster. Nigeria cannot afford any pressure. Yeah, this is referring to Nigeria going to battle. Sorry, Nigeria going through ECOWAS to try and be an intervention force in Niger. I was kicked off alive for calling the host a hawk. Guy was kicked off alive for calling the host a hawk. Guy was talking shock and awe in Niamey. Okay. Eddie, I don't trust none of these foreign powers in Africa. Historically, Russia and China have not disrespected us like the US and Europe. And we need to be honest about these things. Thank you for that point, by the way. We need to be honest about these things. That's exactly it. No matter how you want to look at it, we don't have the same history with Russia and China that we have with France and the various other powers. It's different. So if you do it through the lens of just straight business, we've done deals together. We know each other. We don't have to be friends, but we've done a deal together. Those of you who work for yourselves, you don't do business with people that you like. You don't do business with only people you like. You do business with whoever you can do business with. As long as the business is proper. The business has to be proper. But the people often that will put their arm around you and say, hey, my brother, you know what? Let me pay you next week. And then they never pay you. And then you go and finally ask them for the money. And they're like, I don't owe you. That's different. Those are the worst people to do business with, and those are the ones that are too familiar. But anyway, that's the last comment. I think anyone wants to jump on? Last one. I think you should look why Russia didn't join the rest of Europe. Okay. History is the best teacher. Absolutely. Okay. If that is it, I'm just going to ask you, my people, to please hit the like button on the way out. Thank you again, Lizzie, for the super chat. My sister, long time no see. Give me a 1 if you like the show. Just give me a quick 1. I apologize again if I was, can't believe I went off the whatchamacallit. But what I'll do is I will upload the Instagram live as well to accompany it somewhere, so you can still see my face for those who watch it back. Thank you so much for that. Appreciate you all. I will jump back on. Let me know if you want me to do a few more. I'm going to try and be on a little bit more, but I'm working on some stuff film-wise that it's taking a lot of my time. But anyway, I thank you all for joining in. Make sure you hit the like button. Hit the like button. Last, let's check out Instagram actually. Abs Hashmi, how often will you do these sessions? I don't know. I wish I could say I do them often, but I always forget. D Musingusi, good to see you. Moishi King. Aisha, good to see you as well. Anyway, thank you, my people. Have a great evening wherever you are. Take care, blessings, and we will see you on the next one.